Hmm. That's an interesting question, and I would tell you maybe in some ways I am. I don't like to think myself as someone smart. And sorry if this was the answer that you weren't going for, but that's what came to mind. Well, personally, I don't consider myself a smart person. Uh, there's more areas I'm skilled in than others, but I don't ever that never really comes to my mind that I'm better at stuff than other people. And are trained smart. Hmm. And clearly I'm not smart enough to get that, and that's another reason why I'm not. But it was today. Yeah, I read it for the first time. I've heard about it for a while, and it claims to be the Bay Area's newest transportation system, but it was put in place, I believe, in 2017. And yeah, it's been around for a decent amount of time. Then again, not many people know about it because it is in some ways useless, but it works. Yeah, the Caltrain. It's different. It's diesel, like every other train in the Bay Area, but it uses DMUs, which is only used on the EBART system. So it's, I guess, similar to that. It is relatively high frequency. It comes probably 1 or 2 hours during most of the day. It has higher frequency in rush hour, and then the seats are pretty nice. Actually, they have tray tables. You have a decent amount of legroom. And some of the seats, actually, all the seats have power outlets, so it's well stocked, and it's clean. It's air conditioned. It's a good system. It was more crowded than I expected. Actually, it was empty for the beginning of it. I got on at the very beginning at Larkspur, where I believe I was the only person sitting in the car. But more people got on over time. It was never really fully crowded. But of course, we are in a pandemic, and it was also not in rush hour. It was at 10 a.m., so it was not really a busy travel time. So it was busier than I expected. No, I got off at Petaluma, so I didn't actually get to experience the whole thing. But it was still 40 minutes on the train, so it was decent. It was technically just this 40 minutes because I didn't ride it back. I rode a different bus system back, which is also an interesting experience. Yeah, we should, and it's interesting because the way I transferred to it, so I took the ferry to Larkspur and then walked to the train. That would be the primary use of the train. I would have thought that, so many people would have came from the north and then transferred to the ferry, and you can take the ferry into San Francisco. So it makes it easy to commute into San Francisco, and I would expect that would be its primary usage. But I really don't know I mean, it could have had a decent amount of people in the morning taking that trip, but I wasn't there to see it. But I would expect that that would be its primary usage. But I really don't know that it's actually seeing the level of ridership that they expected, especially during COVID. I think it's good enough, and it's a good segue. I don't see any way that it can be, and I wish it, and I wish I had a reason to think it was, but it's different from most trains, and it can be a war zone between maybe its competitors. But other than that, I don't really see how it is one. It's very it depends on how you define war zone, but it depends on its ridership. If it has ridership, then maybe it competes with cars, and it can be a war zone in that regard. Maybe it might be that country that I've heard in the news about recently, but I don't really know too much about it. Do you want to explain to me what this country is? What do you mean by big things? Like, yeah, I think I know that. And so tell me, where is this Afghanistan country? What kind of what geography does it have? Oh, is it that landlocked country in Central Asia that borders China, Tajikistan, Iran, Pakistan? Is it that one? I don't know. Maybe. A lot of it has been through Instagram mostly because I follow a lot of travel YouTubers who are either have experience going to Afghanistan or know a lot of people there. So I see a lot of content from there, and of course, the citizens there are in a really dire situation in many ways, especially women who are scared of what the Taliban could do. So that's largely been my exposure. Also, too, I as a debater, I am checking a lot of news articles and reading news articles of just what's going on and trying to get the facts of it, whether who's to blame, is anyone to blame, who's responsible, just those kinds of information. At least to give myself a broader perspective and a balanced perspective, at least. I did see a photo. It may have been from U.S. military personnel. Of just all of the I believe they were Afghani citizens trying to flee. Was that the photo you were or the incident you were referencing? Yeah. Yeah, it was something crazy like that. Yeah. Yeah, I'd heard somewhere that the air traffic controller had a vital reaction to hearing how many people were on board, but I never actually heard the details of that conversation. But I'm sure it was shocking to him. Yeah, I looked mostly into Kabul. I did find one article on Kandahar, but it was very similar to the situation in Kabul, of course, because there's really only three or two or so main urban city centers. So it's pretty. There's a lot of similarities among the urban centers and a lot of similarities among the rural cities. I think as we go on. Well, to me, it was pretty similar to what I experienced when I was in South America, which is that there's at least some existing, actually a lot of demand for public transit in the area, but the the government and the city agencies have been really struggling to satisfy that demand. So it's a situation where there's very little actual like public city buses. There are some systems, and I'll probably talk about that later. But for the most part, it's just like in South America, where you have these maybe 7 to 15 person minibuses just going around the streets, and there's really a lack of available stops. There's very actually few marked stops at all, which is given the city a very heavy reliance on either taking these minibuses to wherever they need to go, which you can't really do because they only fit 7 to 15 people, or just resorting on taxis or driving, which is much more common. Yeah, yeah, it's definitely a lot different, and many people, especially drive or walk uh, or take a minibus. But I'm curious, how common is it people to say like ride animals or horses or use transport of that mode outside of the city? Is it fairly widespread? Pretty abysmal. And what's the road situation like? Are there how many miles of roads are there? Where can you go to most of the country on roads? And what are the driving times like? At least because I know that when I was in Peru, at least driving times were really high because either the roads weren't paved or they were super curvy and not really well developed. Is that pretty similar to Afghanistan? The city was paved, but some of the roads in the rural areas weren't like fully paved, or they were really narrow and not really suitable for fast speeds. Hmm. Hmm. Yeah, and it was interesting because one of the things I noticed in looking at the road statistics is that a lot of these projects, at least in the future, to revitalize roads and infrastructure, which similarly in the U.S. we have similar proposals, but for the bulk of the projects in Afghanistan, they weren't government funded, and maybe that's just because there really isn't a legitimate government in Afghanistan that has power. But many of it was based off of foreign direct investment, and it was really interesting to see that trend that Afghanistan is so heavily dependent on foreign investments, and I wonder, like, from like places like Pakistan or Iran, I'm interested in the kind of goals they have in Afghanistan. Well, there's very limited actual work being done right now. There have been a lot of proposals. I believe recently in 2009 of building a bus rapid transit system in Kabul. There have been some maps displayed. But I'm obviously that's like literally the only major transit project that is being considered for Kabul. Also, there's bike lanes as well. I'm not actually sure who's funding them. Yeah, well, because a major issue is that Kabul has a very heavy dependence on cars, obviously, but many of the streets are clogged with street vendors as well. And if you add regular bikes to that mix, then you really clog up the streets. So many people and people doing research on Afghanistan have suggested that if you build bike lanes in Kabul city, then you can really siphon off a lot of traffic onto different parts of the road, and that's really going to speed up driving times because an interesting stat actually is that 66% of driving time in Kabul in alone is spent in traffic. So uh, traffic in general is probably a bigger problem in Kabul than the public transit situation, and many of that is because the streets aren't very well designed or because the people are clogging the streets with street vendors. So I think the bike lanes is probably actually I mean, it's interesting because maybe just in the U.S. it's very politicized, but at least in Afghanistan, actually the government has been very receptive to the idea of trying to get cars off the road because it's been problematic. Because of course, traffic is terrible. Everyone hates the traffic, but also the pollution is really bad, and then and the air quality in Kabul has really suffered. And actually, the government has put in initiatives. They actually, I believe, changed the work week to a 5 day work week before the Taliban took over. Because it used to be a 6 day work week, and now and they wanted to shorten it so that there's at least one less day of heavy commute traffic, which really puts a strain on the pollution. So they've taken initiatives in the past to just minimize the problem, because it's not like people are against it, because nobody is really getting what they want from the crowded streets. Yeah, exactly. And a lot of the images that I've seen are they look almost as if they're one way streets, because there's just uh no there's really no room for cars that fit both directions, and then you have to add on the pedestrians and the street vendors and the like. Yes. Mhm. Well, yeah, I think the other problem with Afghanistan is that the roads are in many places extraordinarily rural, which makes them in many ways susceptible to rapid deterioration. Not only because of the war, but also the weather is really harsh in the winter, and drainage has often been a problem. I've read about that, like in the winter when there's either heavy snow or heavy rain. It can really break down the roads, and of course there's been a government, a U.S. backed government for 20 years, but they only have control over so much of the country, and so much of the country really doesn't even realize that this government exists, because it's really hard to maintain governmental control in Afghanistan. And if you don't have that legitimacy, it's really hard to actively uh, to invest in infrastructure projects, which maybe is one of the reasons why FDI is so high. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, they have very well maintained roads in rural areas. Yeah. Yeah, but even that, like I said earlier, it's the government still really never had like actual de facto. It was really just a de facto government in a sense because they really didn't have any control over a lot of the rural areas, which largely were autonomous, just because they had very little connectivity or even a resemblance to the government. Because it's important to mention that Afghanistan's borders and this essentially forced nation was really driven up by Western powers. So it's really hard to actively like bring everyone in Afghanistan collectively under one government because there's so many ethnic groups across the country that really feel more autonomy to themselves and really have very little pride to be collective with the other Afghanistani people. And I wouldn't expect there to be, which is still a really big challenge that has to be dealt with when putting in projects because you have to really appeal to everyone, and in a sense that might make it easier to do projects in Kabul specifically because that's where a lot of the main Afghan I guess patriotism is. Uh, but outside of Kabul, it's going to be really difficult to actively like get support for government proposals, and of course I imagine we'll mention later, but right now there's obviously a new government in place that is probably not going to be implementing as similar policies or ideals as before. But we'll see what happens there. Well, to be honest with you, I wasn't aware that there were any passenger trains, so inform me on that. Mm. Yeah. Yeah, and 321,000 passengers a year for the COF to that's more than a lot of Amtrak routes, and this is for at least Afghanistan only having 34 million people, is quite a lot of passenger traffic. But also, I'm interested. What's the freight traffic situation like? Are there a lot of freight trains running on the existing rail routes? Well, because Afghanistan's landlocked, right? Yeah, effectively non-existent. It sounds right now. But what's also interesting is that is Uzbekistan, which of course borders Afghanistan, has been spending a lot of effort and resources to build passenger train services, and either I would think there's good connection possibilities to those, and of course Uzbekistan has the high speed Afrosiyab train, uh, and of course I don't expect Afghanistan to get any trains like that anytime soon. But maybe with a lot of foreign investment, they can get something similar, maybe between Kabul and Kandahar. Yeah, and it's really unfortunate because a project like that would definitely bring a lot of economic benefit, not only to the neighboring countries. Clearly, Pakistan wants to do that to give them, I guess, more uh, tourism and economic potential, but that would just bring so many more people to Afghanistan, especially because a train would be a far superior and safer way to cross the Pakistan-Afghani border, which is notoriously dangerous, uh, especially because it literally separates the Pashtun ethnic group. So a train from Pakistan to Afghanistan would be extraordinarily beneficial if that can ever be implemented. Yeah, it is just going to be interesting to see who is able to pay for that and how it can be implemented. But you're right that there really is a distinct lack of unity, and I guess it just stems from them all being extraordinarily different, with a large variety of governing styles, with the Taliban in Afghanistan, or with uh, a cult-like dictator in Turkmenistan, or even like in a sense, democratizing Kazakhstan or Uzbekistan. So there's a lot of potential for unity that would be very beneficial. Just because, like, even in the EU, when we have all the trains going between all of the Schengen area countries, it's very seamless how you can connect between countries, and it clearly has benefits. And I mean, of course, the geography is much harder to traverse in Central Asia, but I don't see why we can't have something similar. Hmm. Yeah, like the connection point is huge, because there's connection potential to Uzbekistan, and then you can connect to Kazakhstan, and we've seen cargo trains running from China to London, relatively often, and full. And Central Asia seems to have a distinct lack of cargo connections as well. That would be huge, because of course you can have cargo connections between maybe just Afghanistan and Pakistan, but if you can branch out, that's even better. Hmm. Yeah, and what's the timeline on it? Like, is it plausible anytime soon? Yeah, and also thinking complicationally, one of the interesting scenarios with Afghanistan is that Afghanistan and Pakistan. This is a bit of a tangent. Are the two countries that still don't have polio eradicated, and largely that's driven by this anti-Western sentiment, and I guess this leads to my thought that a lot of the rural areas really don't want government control in Afghanistan, and I wonder what if there's going to be a lot of local opposition to some of these train lines because it in a sense opens up more connectivity and more chances for other like invasions possibly, or even just taking away autonomy from some of these regions that were really safe from that previously, or even safe from the Taliban. Uh, and also on the lines of that, even just in Afghanistan generally, the average wage is 500 a year, and I don't know how if that's gonna be able to sustain train tickets, but I question how much like actual Afghanis will use these trains. I think your point about economies of scale is probably is largely true. That the I would expect to see cheaper prices, but also too that train lines and infrastructure development will grow the economy and grow GDP growth, which will translate ideally to wage growth as well. Now we haven't really seen that in Afghanistan, despite some economic growth with the U.S. occupation essentially. Uh, and of course wages generally are sticky and don't adapt as quickly. But I would expect that wages will grow over time and allow for more usage. Well, and the situation you described in Tibet is very similar. I would imagine in Afghanistan that it's almost like a forced identity, again, where where the government or whoever is implementing the project is trying to create almost like a nationally or a connected country rather than a fragmented country, which has been for so long. And I don't know. Of course, we have to be there and talk with locals to understand it, but certainly there's a lot of similarities. And even on a local level, for many train projects, there's always people who are holding out because of like eminent domain concerns or because of environmental concerns. So of course there's going to be that kind of opposition, but I don't know what the other opposition would look like. Yeah. Off the top of my head, no. All I know of is just that, or is more locally in California. There has been a lot of opposition in the Central Valley to some of the it was mostly just eminent domain concerns about the high speed rail taking over plots of land, but that's really largely it, and it wasn't a major concern. Do you say in terms of the possibility of? I mean, I think it's possible, because there are existing lines, and it depends on the scale. I would think, but of a system like that could be very well received, and if it is, then of course that would probably streamline the process significantly of just getting it built and getting it used and getting it recognized and actually obtaining benefits from it. It just obviously everything's up in the air with what's going on right now. So from what I know, and you can add on to this from what you know, I all I've heard from the Taliban is that they are going to be peaceful. They're not going to be as strict as they were last time. Uh, but in some ways, the Taliban does have more control over the country than the prior government did. Uh, so in a way, they have more power to leverage and yield, which or to wield, which I guess is positive. But then again, it's the Taliban, to my knowledge, seems much more focused on imposing religious laws, and I would assume that that's much more their priority than developing the country because they've been in power before and they've done very little to develop the country, and it creates war zones, which just really detriments the infrastructure and especially in urban cities, where in a lot of ways it just decreases public transit demand. So I don't think it's going to have a very good effect on actually getting projects done, but they certainly have more ability to do projects, I think. But I'm curious. Hmm. Hmm. And tangentially, actually, one of the interesting transit dynamics in relation to Kabul is that, uh, of course, there's largely Taliban induced. There has been a lot of violence and abusiveness against women, and especially it's been pronounced against female drivers, which has actually convinced a lot of females in Afghanistan to use public transit more often. And actually, there's a bus company, I believe it's Millibus, which is government run, but it doesn't really have that many actual like, services. But there a lot of the government run buses have sections for women to sit alone, just like in Japan, where there's women only cars. So in many ways, supporting public transit would be a necessity to actively like support women. And of course, the Taliban hasn't done that in the past, but they've indicated they want to be more equal and to eliminate the violence against women, and that would have to they would have to invest in public transit to actually make that a reality. And not just good transit systems, they continue to invest in public transit systems and transit systems with, I guess, especially with Saudi Arabia building the high speed rail between Jeddah and Mecca. Even with a very religiously conservative government, maybe that sets the standard for what the Taliban does. Of course, the Taliban is a much different form of governance and has far less experience being a governing body, but maybe they if they have the legitimacy like Saudi Arabia does, then they have more ability to get things done. But anyway, the that concludes our discussion on Afghanistan interpretation. Of course, it is dismaying in some regards to see what is happening in Afghanistan with the Taliban takeover. But as we've discussed, maybe there is hope ahead. Potentially, if the Taliban can commit to doing what they have said they're going to do, many there's obviously, as we've discussed, a lot of potential for longer distance routes, more connections, and better local transport options in cities like Kabul and Kandahar. But of course, it all depends on what the Taliban decides to do and how legitimate people perceive them as.